Welcome to Clocked Out, a show for watch enthusiasts where we discuss the personal stories behind timepieces and reveal the significance they had to the wearer. And today, my guest is Tony Traina. He is a former lawyer turned watch enthusiast, watch writer, and now an editor for Hodinkee. Tony, I'm thrilled that you were able to make it out. I appreciate you being on the show, and welcome.
So thanks for having me on, Tom. Excited to do something like this in Chicago. Great to meet a fellow watch enthusiast in Chicago. Really excited to be able to talk about myself, one of my favorite topics, but more importantly, also excited to talk about some of the watches I brought with you because you've managed to put together a really high quality show here in a short amount of time. So I'm excited to contribute to it.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. And listen, the content makes itself when guys like you agree to come on for free and let me go through their watch collection and talk about it. And so I was reading on your website just before this interview here that your watch journey started with you looking for a watch to commemorate your wedding day. How many years ago was this now?
I got married about 6 years ago, and you're totally right. The first time I really got into watches, I had inherited a few of my grandfather's pocket watches. I kind of went down the rabbit hole initially there, but then a little thing called law school happened, and I kind of forgot about them for a little bit. But during my last year of law school, I was getting married, and I had decided, like many a young gentleman, that I wanted a nice watch for my wedding day. And from there, I kind of did the standard thing you did in the mid-2010s, learned about some of these Instagram brands and their watches is kind of where you oftentimes start, which was a fun time in the world. But from there, I remember discovering a brand called Nomos and kind of at first wondering to myself, like, how could a Nomos cost $2,000 when one of these Instagram brands was $200? Like, what's the 10x delta there? What's going on? And I kind of quickly learned about mechanical timekeeping and all of these things. And I still remember the first time I went to a store to pick up a Nomos and just like see what it was all about. A store called Swiss Fine Timing here in Chicago. We might as well give them a shout out. I remember going there, seeing a Nomos, flipping it over, looking through the case back at the movements and kind of immediately understanding at least a little bit what it's all about, what the hype is all about. I completely bought into Nomos and the story of Glashuta and watchmaking in that part of Germany. And more importantly, just like mechanical watches in general. Now I would kind of look back and laugh at thinking that a Nomos was expensive at $2,000, which to be clear, it totally is.
Yeah.
But,
it's just the beginning.
It's just the beginning, which, we can laugh at, but is very true. But to me, like it still represents a great value in watches, honestly. So I kind of started with a Nomos Tangente for my wedding. And from there, it's kind of really gone downhill. But that's kind of where it all began.
Well, and I think it's a wonderful place to start. I don't have one in the collection at this point, but I know it's been talked about, and I think it's a good stepping stone for many people as they begin to get into this. Or the outside looking in, it's like, you spent how much on this thing that actually doesn't tell time probably as accurately as those Instagram watches do. But once you figure out why it maybe does sway a couple of seconds a day, that actually makes it all the more cool. What was the first purchase that's on the table here today?
From Nomos, one of the first brands that you kind of naturally discover is Tudor, right? Rolex's little, more affordable brother, even though they've kind of grown into their own, I suppose, over the past few years. And I think to me, one of the watches that best represents Tudor growing into their own or becoming their own brand that stands for something a little different is the Black Bay 58. It was this watch that every enthusiast went crazy for at the time. I mean, it set the watch internet on fire, it felt like, for a little bit because of what it was. This heritage-inspired diver when heritage-inspired designs were everything. And everyone had been asking for a slightly smaller watch, a slightly smaller dive watch. And then they released the Black Bay 58, this 39 millimeter heritage-inspired dive watch, a little bit smaller from the Black Bay that they'd been doing.
Thinner too.
A little bit thinner, just more wearable, especially for a smaller guy like me. I remember going out to get one, not immediately, but pretty quickly after that. I've owned a few of the colors, a few of the different metals since then, but the one I've landed on that I probably can never sell because it's got my initials engraved on the back is this kind of a special edition they did with rowing blazers about a year and a half ago. They did this for friends and family, so I've gotten to know friends of rowing blazers. Shout out to Eric Wind here, who is really good friends with Jack Carlson, who is the founder of Rowing Blazers. And I've been friends with Eric Wind. Some of the watches we'll get to on the table here are from him as well, a great sort of vintage dealer. But I was able to get connected and get on the flow team for the friends and family here. And so now I'm kind of stuck with this Black Bay 58. It's, for all intents and purposes, a normal Black Bay 58 with this pink sort of neon-y logo at 6 o'clock. But other than that, this is honestly probably the watch I wear the most. Oftentimes, I think you hand people these like a Tudor, they kind of start to understand that like, oh, wow, this is kind of a well-built thing. It's kind of cool. I could see myself wearing this, even if it is $3,000, $4,000. They kind of start to understand like how it could cost that much, even if it still sounds a little bit crazy or whatever. After the Nomos, I fell pretty quickly into vintage and buying and selling kind of these oftentimes like cheap but fun watches on eBay. The Tudor Black Bay especially kind of got me into the heritage of some of these watch brands from the next level and some of their vintage models. So it starts with Tudor and their subs and the Ranger, and then you obviously quickly get into Rolex and other brands like that. So to kind of preview it here, I brought the 3 watches from probably my 3 favorite vintage brands: Cartier, Rolex, and JLC. And honestly, Tudor is probably my favorite modern watch brand, so shout out to them. From Tudor, it kind of went to Rolex. I brought my Rolex 1016 Explorer. It's the classic thing, simple but not easy, right? 369 numerals. It's beautiful. It's 36 millimeters. It wears super nicely. It's got the oyster bracelet, but it's this simple field watch that's got DNA from, honestly, these World War II field watches that people like my grandpa that I mentioned would have worn. So it was a long journey for me to get to the 1016, even though I learned about it relatively early on. I had bought kind of a bunch of cheaper field watches. I bought vintage Hamilton field watches, modern Hamilton field watches, things from IWC that are in the family, like a Mark 12, other things like that. The Tudor Ranger, the vintage Tudor Ranger was a big one for me, which is essentially the same watch, a little bit smaller, was one of the first vintage watches I thought was really cool. And then eventually I decided, you know what? I've bought a ton of these kind of field style watches that are in the mold of the Rolex Explorer. Why not just go for the 1016? I had even bought, I should mention, the first Rolex I bought was a 90s Explorer, so the 4-digit 14270 or whatever it is. The dyslexia probably got the best of me there, and I probably missed a reference number or something.
We'll let you slide.
But it was the first Rolex I bought, kind of knowing that the 1016 was the ultimate goal in a way, if I should ever be so lucky. And then a couple of years ago, I kind of finally decided, you know what the hell? Let's sell a bunch of stuff and just go for it with the 1016 Explorer. So I eventually saw an example I liked from a dealer, from my friend Eric Wen that I mentioned here. He's the one that was able to hook me up with the Rolling Blazers Black Bay 58 here. But I saw an example from the 1980s that I just really liked. I love the sort of really crisp case here. Kind of all the original lines are on it. And then the lume on it, I really like as well. It's kind of got a little bit of a creamy aging on it, but
does.
It's not.
That's what I was.
It's not too intense, and it's from the 80s, so it's got kind of a. One of the reasons I bought it is it's a vintage watch, obviously, but it's from the 80s, so it's still got a lot of the later or more modern cues from almost a modern Rolex. Like it's this last era of true vintage. So the bracelet is more solid. The end links feel a little bit more solid. It's got a matte dial, and I don't have to like baby it too much. So that's kind of the purpose of a Rolex, or a sports Rolex at least. So I feel comfortable sort of wearing this around still and being able to get it a little wet and things like that without sort of babying it too much the way I might with a real like 60s or 50s vintage watch. So that's kind of why I've skewed towards a later model, and it's a Rolex that I feel as though I can actually wear.
Where did we go from here?
Okay, so as I've kind of referenced, fan of smaller watches in general. That was one of the draws for vintage for me in particular. One of the brands that has always made smaller, more discreet dress watches is obviously Cartier. So I quickly got into Cartier. Some of the first articles I ever wrote for Hodinkee in 2019, 2020, 2021 were about Cartier. And obviously this has become a thing in and of itself now. Just the hype around Cartier has been so sustained over the past few years, which is cool to see on some level. Sometimes it's a little bit overheated and in sort of these flagship models like the Cartier Crash, for example. But in general, I think it's cool to see these watches getting the appreciation they deserve, because Cartier is really, alongside Rolex and Patek and some of these other brands, a really important watch brand. And they've done a lot for the industry over the years. So I got into Cartier, and I've owned a number of watches over the years, but The most recent one that I've had for the past year or so in the collection is a Cartier Tortue. And sort of coincidentally enough, they re-released a Cartier Tortue this year. It doesn't look quite like this example I have, so I have a 1970s Cartier Tortue. These nice enamel dials, nice simple slim yellow gold case. It's a nice simple watch, nice dress watch. I love the shape of the Tortue. I had landed on it after owning some tanks mainly.
Yeah.
I've also owned a Santos Dumont. These kind of rigid, square, rectangular watches. They're beautiful watches. There's a reason that they're sort of more well-known than the Tortue, even though the Tortue is a little bit older, actually. But I just liked the kind of the curved case shape and the way it goes into the sort of the straight lugs at the end, but the way it kind of has this bulbous case shape. I don't know. I appreciate the romanticism, if you want to call it that, of like these straight lines paired with these sort of rounded shape, and then just like the practicality of it. I bought into the history of the Tortue as even being a little bit older than the tank, and I kind of bought into the story there a little bit. So guilty as charged there, I suppose. And then it was kind of fun to see them bring it back again this year. But I've had this watch for a little bit. I think it's quite a nice watch.
It is quite a nice watch. Well, and it's one thing that I feel like Cartier as a brand historically seems to do everything other than produce round watches. It seems like, as you pointed out, that the Crash famously is a very wonky shape. This is a more off the beaten path. I mean, typically watches are circular objects, right? But with the Dumont and stuff like that, and Tank, nothing seems to, obviously they have a couple, I'm sure, but do you know as to why? Is there any sort of like historical reason?
Yeah, I think a lot of these, Cartier has stayed so true to their history as much as any watch brand. And a lot of these, we'll start with Rolex for a second here. A lot of the iconic Rolex sports watches date to the 50s, basically, right? The Explorer dates to the 50s. Submariner, GMT Master, same thing when round watches were already established as a thing post World War II, when, all the GIs basically got these round field watches, and that became the popular thing. But a lot of these Cartier watches and the designs date to this Art Deco era, this pre-World War era, when wristwatches were established as circular things. And Cartier and other brands were making all kinds of shaped watches just to see what stuck, just to sell a watch. I mean, why not offer it in the square, circle, turtle shaped, right? Like Tortue is turtle, right?
Is that what it is?
I mean, yeah. So why not, right? It kind of looks like a turtle shell, right?
I guess
if you
it does.
squint.
Yeah.
So why not, I guess, kind of try any shape? And as people say nowadays, Cartier doesn't really do complications a ton, but shapes are their complication in a way. And I think just a lot of their history dates to an era in which wristwatches were not established as round yet, and they continue to play off of that. And, it comes and goes in waves, I think. It's kind of cyclical, but right now people really appreciate the non-round wristwatches and the shapes from Cartier and some other brands. And I think that's why they've seen so much success recently, especially.
We've had so many Cartiers on the show, which has been great, and it's a good variety amongst them. And I think one thing that's interesting about all the brands that are on the table so far is all of these pieces here are very distinctly kind of like that brand, I guess, to some degree. And I feel like Cartier in particular, you can usually tell from across the room, regardless of size, just by I feel like blue hands is very common. The Roman numerals is obviously very classic too. But how much just personality and branding can get put into a watch. And I think that that's a very cool kind of characteristic of a lot of watch brands, that they're able to kind of have their touch on things without being completely off the rocker.
Yeah, I would say, number one, I'm like a discreet guy, right? Sort of a humble Midwesterner like yourself, perhaps. So I don't necessarily want my watch to scream from across the room, but being recognized in a subtle way is super cool for people who might know. Like you point out the Roman numerals, for example, or the shape or something like that. That can be super cool. And I think the term icon is really overused in probably all industries, watches especially. People call everything an icon. The Black Bay 58 is not an icon, guys. Let's chill out. None of these watches probably are, honestly. Maybe this last one we'll get to in a second. I'm not sure. We can debate that on a different day. But I think something that defines like a not an iconic watch, but like an important watch is something that you don't need to see the watch brand or anything about it. You can recognize it just by the silhouettes or whatever it is. I mean, for Rolex, right? Even just the Oyster bracelet and the Jubilee bracelet has become this instantly recognizable thing. And I think to your point, brands that are able to stay true to that DNA over generations, over decades, is really cool as a testament to sort of the staying power of something they've done. And it takes a lot of commitment to do something like that. But yeah, all of the brands that are on the table, or at least most of them, have been able to do that with at least some of the stuff that you continue to see in their catalog to this day. So the last wristwatch I brought, cliffhanger, was the Jaeger LeCoultre Reverso. Again, one of these kind of instantly recognizable watches from a brand. Kind of JLC is the Reverso in a lot of ways, the way that AP is the Royal Oak or whatever it is. We could go on. Obviously invented in the 1930s. The idea was you could flip it over for polo players, but they started producing it in the 1930s and 40s. And then what happened, kind of like we were just discussing actually, is round watches became in vogue. And they kind of didn't really feel a need to produce a square or a rectangular wristwatch. They didn't think there was any demand for them in the market. So they kind of just stopped producing them through the 50s and 60s. And then, yeah, you're right. I wrote an article about this in Hodinkee a couple of months ago. But what happened was their Italian distributor, the Corvo family, came to their manufacturing facility in Le Sentier in Switzerland. And as the story goes, I mean, it's a little bit apocryphal, but it seems to be true. I talked to the grandson in the Corvo family who told me this story, and they've repeated this story elsewhere. Yeah. But what happened is they found some of these old Reverso cases hidden in some drawer in Le Sentier, and they said, wait, what is that? We need to start making that again. Because this was around the quartz crisis era in Switzerland, or across the world, I should say, where Seiko and Japanese watch brands were starting to figure out how to make battery-powered movements, and mechanical watches were on life support, and they were trying to figure out anything they could. And so this little Italian distributor comes in and says, wait, we need to do that. And they said, no, what are you talking about? No one needs a rectangular watch. And they said, well, give me some of these cases and I'll figure out how to do this. So he went back to Milan, Italy. They figured out how to essentially set a small round movement inside of these rectangular cases. And they brought this back to JLC. And eventually JLC said, okay, fine, let's do it. We'll do it for you. They made 200 of these watches for the Corvo family. 100 of them had these gray dials that you see here, this sort of gray Roman numeral dial. Another 100 had more of a simple white dial. And as the story goes, they sold out in just a few months, which in the 1970s is like instant. That's like at the click of a button. In modern 2024 times.
Bunch of people coming into the storefront.
Yeah, exactly. Things took time back then, simpler times. And they sold out pretty quickly. And JLC kind of recognized that they had something on their hands here that they should kind of redevelop. So after that, they brought back the Reverso, and it's kind of been in the catalog ever since then. And we can kind of tell the story from there, but it remains kind of their icon and a stalwart in their catalog, the main driver of their sales across the world, but all because of kind of the stubborn Italian distributor, the Corvo family, and then, this watch here. Hands here. I was lucky enough to unearth one of these watches. So people, even now, I've written a story about it. I've told the story in a few places, but even now people don't know the story of the Corvo family and the Corvo Reverso, as it's called. And you'll just see these watches listed as JLC Reverso Roman numerals. So it's this really fun story. And in that process, I was finding everything I could, all the previous examples I could. I was lucky enough to find one of these watches that was just listed as Roman numeral dial watch. And as soon as I saw it, I reached out and, was able to acquire it. And I've kept it since then just because I think it's a really cool story. I've gotten to know the Corvo family, the JLC brand a little bit. And it's, like I said, one of my favorite vintage brands. So it's cool to have this JLC. I've got a few others in the collection as well, but this one is obviously my favorite.
When I got into watches, the Reverso was like one of the first watches that came with a party trick to it.
Yeah, totally.
And so I think that's super cool. And I actually didn't know that that it was for polo players to kind of reverse it to protect it. But I know that there are plenty of Reversos now that have faces on both sides. And so is that just because why not? Or do you know any reasoning as to...
Totally. I think, yes. So it used to have functionality, in theory at least. How many polo players
Like most of these watches, once upon a time were supposed to do things. But...
Right. But then eventually, obviously all of these modern brands use sapphire crystals now that are a lot more shatter resistant. And JLC, in addition to the Reverso, has been known as the watchmaker's watchmaker, to use a cliche. Complications, fine watchmaking, doing that at scale in a way few other brands do. And to me, I think it just feels like the natural progression for a modern JLC to combine that fine watchmaking and complications with the Reverso, and using the back of the dial or the back of the Reverso case to put on display its watchmaking just on another level in a way that, it's kind of like, why not nowadays, right? You asked me to bring a few watches, right? And I brought some of my favorite wristwatches from some of my favorite brands, but I was kind of thinking, like, lately I've been into discovering non-wristwatches, essentially. In some of these eras we were talking about, 20s, 30s, even through the 60s, watch brands would put watches into like literally anything, on the theory that it might be more functional or more useful for people. You have to remember this is a time when your car, your microwave either didn't exist or probably didn't have a digital clock on it. So watch brands would put watches in all types of things, everyday objects. And I've had a lot of fun just kind of discovering these from all kinds of different brands over the last few years, honestly. But the last few watches I've acquired are non-wrist watches. One thing is they're just a lot cheaper. They're more under the radar.
Yeah.
You can find a lot of this stuff for less than $1,000, honestly, and it's super fun to collect. This is kind of how I got into buying wristwatches back in the day, buying cheap Movados and Mitos on eBay. And now I've kind of evolved that into buying these silly little non-wristwatch things that obviously have zero function, but they're fun to prop up on the desk. So we'll start with the Movado Hermeto here. So this is essentially a purse watch from Movado. It slides in and out.
See if you can get it on the mic here.
All right, we'll get it on the mic. We'll see if it...
Probably won't. But
we'll see if this translates. Sorry to you on the YouTubes if it doesn't. But it slides in and out. It does this cool thing, actually, where as you're sliding it, it's actually winding the crown here at the top. So these Movado Hermetos are basically just purse watches that you would close up, toss them in your purse. You can find them in all kinds of sort of variations. You can find Cartier signed ones, Hermes signed ones, things like that. Movado made a lot of them, and then they were just retailed by these brands. So this is a nice one, kind of a real Art Deco style. It's got brigade numerals, and then there's just kind of two-tone case. It's a silver case, but it's got this two-tone gold and silver case. It's really cool. And it's got a stand. It's got a stand. It does it all, man.
It does it all.
So, most mornings I've got this sitting just right by my laptop. So most mornings when I wake up and sit down at the desk, I give it a few winds and then kind of just prop it up there. And it's fun to sort of look at throughout the day. And then obviously kind of like the Reverso, it's kind of a fun thing to fidget with.
It's a party trick.
If you've got just incurable anxiety like I do, and I think so many people do, it's a fun thing to play with throughout the day.
Well, and it's such a cool thing too. When it is sealed shut, you wouldn't guess that this would open up into a watch, would you?
No, yeah, totally. It could be anything. You could have your drugs in there, whatever you want.
We could. Well, speaking of drugs, you would probably have to be a drug
what
dealer.
A transition.
To you set me up for it to pull this one off. And so this is an Omega money clip.
Yeah, right. So the last thing I brought for you, another sort of miscellaneous watch object. This is kind of the most recent watch I acquired. Eric Wins is getting a lot of shout outs on the podcast or on the YouTube show here.
He might be the guy we need to talk to next.
Yeah. Next time he comes to Chicago, he gifted me this one, so I won't claim that I bought this one myself. So a cool little gift there. But this one I bought myself. I actually bought this when I was in Geneva recently for a big watch trade show every year. There's a flea market essentially every weekend or every Saturday or Sunday there. I can't remember. So the last day before I headed to the airport, pretty much, I popped into the flea market, saw this beautiful little Omega money clip. Pretty beat up dial, if we're being honest, but it's running. It's got these nice blue steel hands, got nice little brigade numerals at 12, 3, and 9. And honestly, I had been looking for money clips, like watch money clips for years. I thought in theory it was this kind of functional idea. I thought I might actually use it. I don't. I kind of just, again, stand it up on my desk and wind it every once in a while. I use the money clip thing to just kind of stand it on the desk. I'm not sure I've ever carried it around for its functional or stated purpose, but first of all, it was just a cool find for me in Switzerland. I'd never bought a watch in Switzerland. Funny enough, I had been thinking that entire week about buying a moon swatch at the,
Oh gosh,
I know.
you made a better decision.
I like to think so. I was about the same amount of money too.
Interesting.
A few of my friends, coworkers from Hodinkee had gone previously in the week to buy the Snoopy moon swatches that had just come out at the time.
Yeah.
And kind of made a quick trip to the flea market, like I said on the last night. And I've never been a huge vintage Omega guy, but this is sort of a fun thing. And I don't know, man, they're just fun. It's kind of fun to think about what kind of crazy person would have used this, like you said, like a drug dealer or whatever.
Or
I don't know.
who knows? I mean, I don't know what you'd be selling in the 20s, really, but maybe it has booze.
Where you've got so much spare stacks that you've got a money clip to hold
it's
your
a
money.
flex. That is, again, a watch on your wrist is one thing, but if you have a watch on your money clip, that is very cool.
I mean, unfortunately, I don't carry around cash at all, but I probably should start. It doesn't really handily like hold my credit cards. I wish it did.
A brand needs to get on that. All the smart wallets that have the cool little functional things. Rolex or Omega need to come out with, or some brand, any brand will take.
The thing is, okay, so like I said, this thing was like a few $100 at the flea market. I tried to bargain a little. I'm not like these TikTokers that's good at bargaining.
A shrewd negotiator.
I got bowled over, I think, there at the Geneva flea market. But I got a few bucks off. But the problem is, if a modern brand, if Omega even released a thing like this, first of all, no one would buy it, and it would probably cost like $5,000.
Yeah,
so it's a lot more fun. It's a lot more fun to buy it for a few $100. So then it is really sort of just this totally, it's a tchotchke, right? Let's call it what it is.
Well, so I know you have many more watches that aren't here, but I always like to ask people what their future holds for watches. And it sounds like you're interested in acquiring some more non-wrist watches. But do you have a grail piece, any sort of stuff that you're working on, anything that is missing in the collection that you feel like is needed?
Yeah, look, I'm sure I do have grail pieces. I think as I've worked more full-time in the industry, like I said, I've kind of focused on vintage watches mainly. I have thought about trying to acquire or consolidate into a nice modern watch from a brand like Longa, or maybe a nice Chopard dress watch. The 1860 that they released last year is one of the most beautiful modern watches to me. But like I said, Movado was one of the first brands I really fell in love with. But I'm always kind of looking in all of the corners, shaded corners of the internet for cool Movados. I've had some of their vintage chronographs. I really like them. M95 Movado chronographs for those who are really looking for something to get into. I've owned a couple over the years. I've owned some time-only Movados over the years, but it's kind of one of my original loves. A lot of these watches have the aesthetic, even sometimes use the same suppliers as much more expensive watches from brands like Patek or Vacheron or whatever else. So I've continued to maintain the love for Movado, but that's kind of where I'm at in my sort of collecting journey, if you will. But nothing really burning desire. No burning desires, I would say, to acquire anything right now.
Do you think, I always like to try to relate people's watch choices to their experience. And so with your training as a lawyer, you went to law school, you were in that field. Do you feel like that has swayed you in one direction with watches? Do you think it's altered your watch collecting philosophy in any way?
I think like any serious watch collector or watch enthusiast, a good lawyer is like a real sicko in the sense that they tend to get, they really enjoy doing legal research and writing briefs and all those types of things. So there's a natural transition into some of that, that mind sickness of being a lawyer into being a watch collector. But I think like generally the one thing that has informed just the type of watches I like more than anything is, number one, sort of liking more small, discreet watches, which to me comes from honestly just growing up as, like, if I may say, sort of a humble Midwesterner. Grew up in Indiana, lived in Chicago for almost the past decade. There's not a huge culture around Chicago or where I grew up of these big ostentatious watches, big gold blingy watches or any of that stuff. I tend to gravitate towards discreet watches that don't stand out, that don't demand attention, that don't demand to be asked about, that just kind of sit there on your wrist. And like we were talking about earlier, if someone notices something like the Roman numeral dial or the shape of the Reverso case, maybe they'd be inclined to ask a question, but you've got to be really tuned in kind of to ask a question like that usually. Even something like a Nomos, right? You kind of have to be like, what's that? That's a pretty looking clean design for a watch.
Yeah.
But for me, I think that kind of is the thing that has informed the type of watches I buy more than anything. It's just like the environment that I grew up in and continue to live in.
And my second question is, I'm sure there are a lot of people that are watching that imagine being a writer for Hodinkee is an absolute dream job. And so what sort of advice would you have for someone that maybe wanted to maybe potentially work for Hodinkee, or at least just get their feet wet in the watch world? How could they be a little bit more involved?
Yeah, I think for me, I started just by writing my own personal newsletter on a weekly basis, and especially during the pandemic, kind of really picked that up and doing it every week. And I think, like I've kind of talked about here, I kind of developed a strong POV on what I liked and didn't like, especially in the world of vintage watches, and kind of developed a niche that people came to me for. Vintage watches are admittedly a very small niche within what is already a niche, sort of the greater watch world, but becoming known for something in particular and having a perspective and knowing like what the hell you're talking about in that specific area is very important. And people coming to you for that perspective and that POV, and kind of not just being a generic cookie cutter kind of person, I guess, is like really important. And I think it's important to figure out a niche that you feel is being undercovered and kind of trying to dive into that and establishing yourself number one in that space, and then also establishing why people should care about it. And then you kind of grow from there and expand your knowledge base and what you're interested in, all those types of things.
For the people that want to tune in to what you write about, get a little bit more tuned in with what you do and I guess your personal tastes, how did they do that?
Yeah, so I guess this is shameless plug, huh?
But obviously that camera, this camera.
That's right. I host the Hodinkee podcast every week. We have great guests lined up, and also have just my fellow editors and colleagues talking every week about whatever's happening in the world of watches. Also follow me on Instagram. It's just my name, Tony_Traina. And then I still send out a pretty regular newsletter, just an update on everything I'm up to, where I'm at. Maybe you'll have seen my YouTube video because I'm sure I'll link it there. A weekly or pretty regular newsletter that's just in my Instagram bio. Find it there. And that's about it.
And that is it. Tony, I want to thank you so much for bringing these out. It's always a pleasure being able to just take a peek into somebody else's watch collecting journey without me having to spend all the money to acquire it and all the knowledge that goes along with it. So I appreciate you coming out.
Thanks so much for having me.
I look forward to seeing more of Hodinkee articles and all that you do within the watch community.
Thanks so much for having me, and I am excited to see where this channel grows, and I'm excited to be able to say that I was one of the first guests.